Right, well, everyone, this is going to be the inaugural Write Night presentation. So the idea behind this is that the Snickle allows us to have like a very tangible journal-based way of interacting with each other on intellectual and creative platform and in that environment, but we want to try to branch out even more. So we've done that through Write Nights, where we can all get together and then co-work together, bounce ideas off of each other. And then this is a further evolution where we envision us being able to then present and share in a more formal way, where people are given the floor and then we can have discussions and so on. Kind of inspired by a lot of things that I found to be really edifying in my undergrad experience, where I was a member of 2 debating societies, and this was kind of the mode of the weekly meetings, was just 2 to 3 presentations that would take up 2 to 3 hours worth of time. And it was very, very cool to see what people thought of, what they shared, engage with that, and I think I took away more from that than many of the things that I've read. So trying to broaden the Snickle's ability to foster this creative and intellectual discourse within the community. So this is going to be the first example of that. We're also going to have time tonight for more presentations. And then going forward, these monthly events will have recurring abilities to present anything that you'd like to an audience and then be able to dialogue about that. Ultimately, it can be recorded as this is being recorded now, or it can be done without being recorded at the discretion of the presenter. So the topic that I'm coming to present for this inaugural Write Night is something that kind of segues into a thing that's always been of interest to me and is recently, in a new way, of interest to me based off of a conversation I had recently. Namely, what is art and what qualifies as art? What are aesthetic theories? What is beauty, and how does that relate to other virtues? Is it transcendent, etc.? That I've always been fascinated by. So this is an example of a modified speech that I had given when I was an undergrad on video games and art, entitled "Video Games as Art." To dive right in, before starting the presentation, I want to go over an outline of how I plan to proceed. First things first, the topic of this presentation is to explore the extent to which we should consider video games to be an art form. Thus, we shall first begin by me, perhaps foolishly, trying to define what art is in order to guide the speech. I will then go into some arguments that will address the claims that video games are not art, because these video games will help me in my attempt to draw boundaries around the term and to help include and exclude video games in the realm of art as I define it. In the third place, I will describe and explain which video games, if any, clearly count as not art. In the fourth point, I will describe what video games, if any, I consider to be art forms. Finally, I will describe what video games may gray my distinctions, and so on. So to begin, the question, what is art, is not just a funny joke. This is, something that's so broad that people can have totally different opinions. And I sometimes will even use it as like a, well, what is art thing to just be annoying rhetorically. That being said, while it may be very frustrating to answer, I think that it ought to be engaged with seriously to create a genuine answer. Now, a warning, I have no formal training in aesthetic or art theory, and I am not a philosopher, so this is all amateur postulating.
Are you a cat?
And I am not a cat. Sorry, I love that meme reference if anybody gets it. But despite that fact, I will pull a Leroy Jenkins of sorts and spit out an answer. I would say that art is the intentional application of the creative faculties with the purpose of communicating real or perceived truths or experiences that point beyond the artwork itself. I think it's these key portions that define art well. That being said, there are various and sundry definitions that I find to be frustrating, if not falsifiable. One of my friends in college was fond of the definition of art as being what artists do, which I think is delightfully circular and very hard to disprove, but also equally unhelpful. And then a further elaboration on that is art is whatever you say art is. Also a very, hard to disprove thing, but something that I feel like leaves more to be wanted. So I think that this allows a very clear understanding of what art is, that it is a fundamentally human activity, that it is something that requires ingenuity, requires creativity, and is trying to express meaning. It is our way of expressing things beyond logic, our way of expressing things and experiences that would otherwise be almost impossible to transcend the boundaries of our inner thoughts and experiences to others. So with this being said, I will endeavor to show this later on. I think that some, but not all video games meet this definition. In order to better understand why, I think it is helpful to next examine some arguments from those who say that video games can never be art. So the second point here is the argument against video games as an art form. So the first subsection would then be one of the best arguments, and one of the first arguments to cover is the one put forward by the late Roger Ebert, who contends that video games, or rather games of all variety, can never be considered an art form. Ebert said that games are essentially different than art, in that games are oriented towards achieving a discrete, competitive goal, and are regulated by rules that limit them and define a method to achieve that ultimate goal of winning. For example, chess, he argues, could not be considered art. Good chess players and impressive chess moves are simply examples of good chess players and chess moves, which, while impressive, are ultimately oriented towards achieving a singular and encapsulated goal, in this case, winning. The second argument ends up looking a bit like the first, but with some minor alterations. An interesting argument put forward by Leo Leibowitz in The New Republic is that video games cannot be art because they are the product of computer code. He says, and this may make sense, but what exactly does he mean? In this argument, Leibowitz acknowledges that while aesthetics are an important aspect of video games are essentially just code, and code is simply a tool for accomplishing some set goal. He claims that code can only ever be a series of sterile if-then statements. Thus, the very essence of the game, not just the gameplay itself, shows that video games cannot qualify as art. For the third point, and this is the video games that I would consider to not be art, I would say that I would agree with the critics that there is a meaningful distinction between art and games. Generally speaking, I buy the idea that having a set goal and following very specific functions prevents the possibility of creatively and intentionally communicating a transcendent message to others. In other words, I agree with Ebert that chess is not art, rather it is simply a game. However, as I will explain later, I would say that a video game must be purely objective-based in order to not qualify as art in my eyes. For this reason, I think that there are indeed some video games I would not consider to be art. I would include Tetris and Pong in this category of video games that are purely games and not art. There is nothing transcendent, nothing beyond the game itself that an audience can learn or that creators can communicate in these purely objective-based games. A high score in Pong does not force me to reconsider my worldview, or even tell me anything other than that the person who achieved that high score was just very good at the game, a message that is purely self-referential. Indeed, since first giving this speech years ago in my debating society, there have been many developments in video games that require scrutiny. One of the most major examples I would consider to be outside of the purview of art is the rise of freemium gaming. These dopamine-mining, hyper-capitalistic games incorporate poor graphics and simple repetitive tasks that whose only goal is to accumulate more in-game currency and perpetuate the spiral. To move on to the fourth point, what I would consider to be actual art, While I do agree with Ebert's broader criticisms for most video games, I reject his logic. There are plenty of video games that represent art in its highest form, combining unique aesthetic qualities with a deep message. Games such as To the Moon, or Spec Ops: The Line, or Bioshock, etc. Indeed, it is this combination that I just mentioned that is key to understanding my argument. You see, there are critics, I think that the critics are oversimplifying video games. They focus too narrowly on the fact that they have aspects of the game, the goal of winning or of finishing the game at the very least. But this is a reductionist view of video games and is simply incorrect. Video games are a combination of many qualities such as audiovisual features, rules-based gameplay, and story. And I think story is key. Indeed, I think modern video games can be best understood as plays, where the leading actor is the one playing the game. You see, actors have specific goals that they must achieve, play the role without a hitch, for instance, and can perform well or poorly in doing so. Yet they are engaged in carrying out a pre-written story. And yet, this is most certainly art. A video game player does essentially the same thing. Much like with plays, the stories in video games are able to communicate very deep and moving messages in creative ways, and the player acts these out. Take Spec Ops: The Line, for instance. In this game, you are thrust into the middle of a Middle Eastern conflict as a soldier, just like any Call of Duty game. But you quickly find out that this game is far more complex and morally taxing as the game unfolds. Although you simply begin fighting bad guys in the desert, you gradually become exposed to increasingly more morally distressing situations. Without giving away too much, over time you begin to make decisions that you would have thought yourself incapable of making beforehand. Indeed, the message on the loading screens even begins to make you question yourself. For instance, at the beginning of the game, the loading screens are typically filled with helpful hints, like press X to reload. But as the game progresses, the message character changes. At one point in the game, you find yourself being charged by what appears to be a mob of enemies. And there are indeed enemies in this mob. You are then directed to conduct a targeted chemical weapon artillery strike against that mob, using a drone whose camera you pick up and then control remotely. Unbeknownst to you in the moment, civilians actually make up the majority of this mob, and you find out later on that you could have easily avoided killing these civilians had you simply fired at the unarmed soldier, or at the armed uniformed soldiers earlier. However, most people with whom I have spoken who have played this game have shelled the civilians out of fear. You are in the moment and everything happens so fast. After this level, the loading screen then asks you, are you starting to feel like a hero yet? And then you can see, to ignore the story is to ignore an essential component of most video games, and is essentially like ignoring the play for an actress's bad performance. Newer and even more profound games have been developed that push the envelope further of what video games are able to express. For instance, a prime example is that Dragon Cancer, which is an exploration/adventure game a la the 1990s hit game Myst. That Dragon Cancer tells the emotional roller coaster of a story of the parents of Joel, a child who is dying of cancer, and what they experienced as parents. During this emotional tour de force, you assume various roles. At one point, you're a random bystander in a doctor's office, and with the doctor and the family. You're often the parents, and even at one point, Joel's toy, and so on. What's more, Joel's animated character is a body without a face. Over the course of the game, you're able to develop a strong understanding of the ways Joel's parents felt about the experience of having a child with cancer in ways that would be simply impossible to communicate without a video game, as you adopt the identity of the parent. Finally, even the mass-marketed video games, which are often mistaken for being shallow, have incredibly deep plots. Take Halo, for instance. There are many instances where creative and meaningful messages are put forth to the overall plot. One of the most important subplots is Cortana, who is an AI companion of the human Master Chief who you play, teaches Master Chief what it really means to be human, and not the other way around. And even the game's ability to explore complex social phenomenon like communitas in Disaster. Communitas being that feeling of intense community bonds with strangers or people you used to think of in particular modes in a hierarchical structure, where all of these things are leveled and you have direct person-to-person deep connections, oftentimes in disaster scenarios like post 9/11 or in Hurricane Katrina. They simulate this through alien invasion of the human species, and you are thrust into this game where you have an almost gleeful feeling of fulfilling one's duty by fighting back these video game aliens to protect humanity. So we now arrive at my final point, and you may be asking yourself, but Brad, not all video games have stories. What about SimCity or Minecraft? Video games like these do blur the lines, and it's only gotten worse over time. We now arrive at what I like to call the problem of No Man's Sky, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I would answer that Minecraft and SimCity, when played in creative mode, are still art because the player is involved in finishing the artwork. The player turns sub-creator. The materials are provided to the player, or artist in this case, who may take his or her own masterpiece and create it. In creative mode, it is art. In survival mode, however, the objective is clear and limited. You are still sub-creator, but for the purposes of achieving a self-referential goal. Thus, these games can be used for both artistic and non-artistic purposes, much like chess pieces can be used as a prop in a work of art, or for a game. Thus, they do blur the line. But why is No Man's Sky a problem? So No Man's Sky is a video game that looked absolutely amazing in all of the pre-release information that was given to us. It was revolutionary, in the words of its own creators. However, upon its release, it utterly failed. No Man's Sky was to be a massive, procedurally generated game in which 18 quadrillion stars populated a universe in which players could visit any one of those stars, literally limitless in its scope. This game was supposed to be a new frontier for video games with constant player interactions and a live community that would create civilizations within this universe. But it only received a 35% rating on the Steam store and a 2.1 user rating on Metacritic. And so the game received criticism ultimately for its lack of story, the repetitive gameplay, and overemphasis on quantity and not quality of world building. For instance, every single one of the 18 quadrillion worlds had the same 2 outposts as bases on those planets for players to visit and refuel, and absolutely no fortresses or temples or gorgeous cities that were left to explore. Just landscape and various cool trees and aliens that may be different, but nothing truly mind-bending. What's more, all of these 18 quadrillion star systems were essentially made by an algorithm. By now, Leibowitz's argument from earlier may be starting to sound convincing. Indeed, unlike Minecraft, you cannot really create anything, either outside of ship upgrades, which is more like a mini-game. You just explore, and the side quests that were available only served further exploration. Learning an alien language to unlock further travel options via interactions with very bland and underdeveloped sentient races is an example. So this poses a really interesting question. If the star systems themselves are not created by a person and are indeed created by a mechanistic algorithm, are they still art? Ultimately, I think that it's fair to say that No Man's Sky is likely still art because the codes themselves were created by the game makers as a creative expression in the game's to further the game's goal of exploration and satisfy our curiosity. Or perhaps it was meta art all along. Indeed, this is where I think Leibowitz missed the point. Code is analogous to paint in a painting. It is just the medium in which the artwork is unveiled. So all of this is to say that I think that there are some very interesting buckets to put video games in. Many of them fall into clearly artistic buckets. Many of them kind of blur the line of, is this just, mindless dopamine mining, etc., for, repetitive tasks that have no extrinsic meaning, and even low production quality, no aesthetic or story meaning behind it. Things that come to mind is that stupid, Caveman, or, Clash of Clans, for instance. And then Pong, etc. And then you have those things that are more clearly, difficult to categorize as art. I kind of blurred the lines there. Anyways, basically, 3 categories: very clearly art, very clearly not art, and then many things kind of in between as video games become more immersive and diverse in their substance. So that is my TED Talk.